You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm coming to you with a healthy dose of man flu in this last final few episodes of the year. But I just wanted to really close out 2025 with a best of 2025 series. We've had some fantastic episodes really on the podcast over this last year. And I wanted to really, in this episode and the next one, just review 5 of the top, really most downloaded episodes that resonated with you, the listeners. And they've not just resonated, but also challenged practice and reinforced some of the fundamentals, and also reminded us why, I guess in a way, why this work matters. So in this episode, you're going to hear, firstly, Mike Christian reviewing Prehospital Resuscitative Thoracotomy for traumatic cardiac arrest. Then we're going to progress to the evolving nature of major incidents with Adam Desmond. Then Paediatric Assessment in critical care with Anna Dobbie. Frailty in Geriatric Patients with Iain, Wilkinson and James Adams. And then finally the last year of life, focusing on palliative and end-of-life care. Quite nicely in a way, each episode speaks to a different phase of life, and indeed a different clinical challenge and a different kind of responsibility to that patient group. These episodes really capture the full spectrum of prehospital emergency care, from critical care decisions to thoughtful values-based care at the end of life. So they really do remind us that excellence in practice isn't really just about technical skill or clinical algorithms, but I think one of the themes that's really come through in the podcast is that of really clear communication, teamwork, this semblance of MDT, multidisciplinary team working, and compassion. So I just want to say really to every guest who's trusted the platform and indeed shared their expertise and given over time really to contribute their experience and stories. Thank you for that. It's been extremely valuable. We've recorded nearly 100 episodes this year, and it's been a real privilege to walk through 2025 with these guests. But also to you, the listener, for listening on night shifts, between calls, or indeed on commutes. Your continued support and messages and thoughtful feedback really has shaped the direction of this podcast. More than you might realise. So I get around 2 to 3 emails a week suggesting content or indeed guests from various corners of the globe, and it's really fascinating, indeed insightful and helpful just to pick up on those and just to cover off areas of prehospital care which otherwise might be go unnoticed. So just to everyone who's shared these episodes, indeed also shared suggestions with me, or indeed use them to inform teaching and reflection, I'm sincerely grateful for your contributions, both towards me and towards the wider listeners. So finally, just thank you for being part of our podcast community through 2025. Your engagement is really what makes the conversations possible, and it's been a real privilege to just continue them with you into this year ahead. So also I'll just say and preface that some of these conversations, listener discretion is advised. So there's some really hard-hitting stories and indeed reflections in these next few clips you're about to hear. So please do just be mindful of that before you continue. So here's our first clip with Mike Christian.
For me, a personal story that really drives sort of why this was done, and it goes to why I joined London's Air Ambulance in the first place. And in 2015, I was visiting London to attend a different conference, saw there was a pre-hospital conference, so I thought I'd stop in. I was a mid-career intensivist in Canada, working in having been a paramedic before, now working as a sort of medical leadership role in a air ambulance system. And it was a classic sort of, at the time, although it's changing now, North American system of primary paramedic response. And, in the service at the time, we were getting to the point where there was discussions and decisions being made about not even dispatching to traumatic cardiac arrest, launching the helicopter, because it was felt to be futile and there was such poor outcomes. Was it either cost effective or, triaging between the demand? Was it worthwhile to dedicate a team to that? So I was in London for this conference, sat there for a day, had a really interesting conference. There was this young man sitting next to me throughout the whole day. I was sitting at the very back row, kind of felt like a bit of an interloper into this world of pre-hospital care in the UK. And we chatted. He was just finishing his first year or first semester of engineering at college, and really nice guy. Seemed bright and energetic and enthusiastic about life. And then at the very last talk of the day, I realized that this guy who I thought was a volunteer med student or something, or volunteer helping out with the conference, he's on stage at the front, and he lifts up his shirt and reveals his thoracotomy scar. And just over 6 months before, he was lying dead in a parking lot, had had a stab wound to his left ventricle, and the London's Air Ambulance team came, did a thoracotomy on him, resuscitated, treated his tamponade, and now not only is he a survivor, but he was thriving, and that blew my world. And I was like, I need to understand how they're doing this, what they're doing, everything I saw about the clinical governance there that day and the whole process, and it completely transformed my view of what outcomes can be for traumatic cardiac arrest, and that led me to come to London for a sabbatical that ended up lasting 6 years. And that's what for me was wanting to get this information out to the world again, update it, and really to give back to what London's Air Ambulance has given to me and how it's changed my career and my view about clinical medicine. The one thing is that speed is of the essence for the patients, particularly in tamponade. And in those patients, we found that if they had a resuscitative thoracotomy within 10 minutes of arrest for cardiac tamponade, they had a 40% survival, which is remarkably high. Overall, for tamponade, it was a 21% survival in the study. And then, but the other key thing is really looking at really for patients with a sanguination, how poorly they did. So only a 1.9% survival, and really starting to shift our thinking around the how to treat that group of patients. So those are some of the key findings. We really need to think about how we get people there faster and how we address the timely delivery of the intervention in tamponade. That's the other sort of key piece that comes out of this, and then really thinking about our decision making. And I think we can touch on that maybe more in a minute, but getting into physiology and using that to guide our decision is really, I think, one of the other key takeaways is reframing how we think about these conditions.
So next up is Adam Desmond talking about the evolution of major incidents and really just recollect his visceral account of 7/7 for the podcast. It's quite hard listening, but nevertheless, the brutal reality really of what he faced, what we all faced down in the underground at 7/7. So here is what was the most downloaded episode of the podcast this last year with Adam Desmond.
As we walked down the tunnel towards the train, not knowing what we were going to, still not knowing what we were going to, this is just me and Sam, with very little light and pathetic torches, the ones you recharge in the fridge, which did nothing. I can remember two men walking towards me, one with a pink jumper and one with a yellow jumper on. Spoke to me for a couple of minutes. You could see down the middle of their jumpers was black, but the rest was pink, and the other one was yellow, where their coats, I think they'd either taken their coats off because it was so hot, or maybe they'd been blown off, I don't know. But they're covered in soot, coughing and spluttering, and they cared so much about me and Sam. That's what got to me. They cared so much. They kept saying to me, don't go in there, son. You don't need to be in there, son. You don't need to be in there. We nicknamed them the golfers because they looked like a couple of golfers because of the jumpers, and they had big bellies. And we carried on. I directed them towards the platform where we'd come from, and we carried on in. And then we were directed by a colleague of ours to Sam and Lee, Samantha Badham and Lee Harris. And Sam and Lee they'd been blown out of the train when the bomb was detonated. They'd gone through the wall of the train, hit the tunnel wall. The train was moving when he detonated. Hit the tunnel wall, and then they'd been rotated like this between the train and the tunnel wall until the train came to a stop. So they were 3 carriages back from the bombed carriage, but they were down on next to the tracks by the wheels of the train. So you're in a tight space about as wide as your shoulders. and they had devastating injuries. Devastating injuries. There was a dead body as well, about 10 feet from them. Sam had had her right leg amputated, amongst other horrific injuries. We didn't have tourniquets or blast dressings then. We didn't have radios for comms. I remember I cut off my left trouser leg to make a makeshift tourniquet, which didn't do anything, but you felt like you had to try and do something. We gave them lots of intramuscular tramadol. It's the only pain relief we had at the time. One of the HIMSS paramedics who I knew well, Phil Nation, came. He gave ketamine to both of them because the legs, Sam's left leg and Lee's right leg, they were lying next to each other. Their legs, where they'd been spun, had been wound round each other like a girl's plait 3 or 4 times, and we had to undo their legs. That was horrific. That was horrific because the drugs we gave, I don't think did anything because they just screamed. They just screamed. And then the underground staff brought 2 World War II stretchers that they had on the stations then, on the trains. And we loaded Sam and Lee. Sam made it very clear to me amazingly, they were both conscious and amazingly they could both speak. But I had to talk very quietly into Sam's ears so she could hear me. If I shouted, she didn't hear me at all. But if I spoke like I am now, she could hear me. And I said, Sam, we're going to take you out of here now. And she squeezed my hand tightly. And I leant in so she could talk to me. And she said, please, you won't leave me, Adam, will you? And I said, I'm not going to leave you while we're in the tunnel, Sam. No, we're not. But when we get upstairs, I'm going to have to pass you on to some of my colleagues. And I've got to come back down here. And she seemed okay with that. But I promised not to leave her in the tunnel. And then I carried Sam out towards the King's Cross platform with, I think it was a police officer and a member of the underground staff, a lady in her 60s. We carried Sam out. My crewmate Sam he helped us initially, then he went back to help with Lee Harris, and they took Lee Harris out the Russell Square end. As we got to the platform with Samantha Badham, we placed her on the platform, and one of the fire brigade managers really upset me, just the way he spoke about her. He implied that she should be in a body bag, and I lost it, mate. I lost it, completely lost it. I went for him. It's pathetic, absolutely. Sitting here now saying that I picked a fight. He was about 6'5", I mean. I'm 5'10". It was, and I was 33 at the time, but you remember me then. I was not a fighter, and I never have been. It was pathetic, but I was, like I said the other day, my brain was functioning like thalamic level. Yeah, I had no higher function than an angry gorilla, and that's what I became. I just became this useless idiot. Policeman was pulling me off, and it was just stupid schoolboy crap. And then when I went back to Sam, she died. And that's what sticks with me, is that I let go of her hand, mate. Let go of her. I had one job. I had one job. That's everything she'd been through. Everything she'd been through that day. I had one poxy, easy job that a 5-year-old could have done. Held her hand and not let go. And I let go to have a fight with an inanimate object. And she died while I did that. And that's my trauma to live with now. Because of that, I think I've never forgotten her. Never. Think about Sam every day.
So next up is Anna Dobbie, talking about paediatric assessment in critical care. It was extremely valuable to get Anna's perspective on the podcast as the clinical lead of London's Air Ambulance, but also just her lived experience of treating many sick children throughout her time. So she dropped many pearls of wisdom in this episode, and I found it really helpful and insightful just to interview her as well. So here it is.
The thing about paediatrics is small kids don't lie. They show you what's wrong with them. They may not be able to talk and localize, but actually if you examine them carefully, you can work out what's wrong with them. And actually, the joy of paediatrics is that you have a few more skills in your toolbox to be able to assess kids, as well as the ones that you usually use. And so actually, kids are almost easier because you have more things to be able to use in your assessment to really find out what's going on. So I think just that degree of reassurance is this is familiar. This is very similar to what you normally do, with just a few nuances, and just using those particular differences that we'll highlight as we talk to absolutely make your assessment completely 100%. I always say to people, actually, the small paediatric cases who are really sick are the ones to go just that little bit slower. Take a deep breath, slow yourself down, calm yourself down, and actually you can almost go quicker by doing that. Take your time and do it once and do it well.
So looking at red flags, Anna, and just maybe some of the red flags that really stick in your mind for critically unwell paediatrics. How can pre-hospital teams really recognise these early, and what's your counsel when maybe mentoring and or signing off some clinicians at London's Air Ambulance?
Yeah, I think if you approach the scene, again, particularly from my area of trauma, and the child is still lying on the floor, that's a key thing. Just as simple as that, of just the child hasn't got up, isn't in mum's arms, is wanting to lie still. And if you think about all the children that you've seen in your practice, the ones that are really unwell or that have broken necks or broken legs are the ones that can't get up and do anything. The ones that get up, cry and give mum a cuddle generally don't have anything too life-threatening wrong with them. And that can be quite a reassuring sign. But the ones that are lying still, or that abnormal cry, we've all heard babies crying and young children crying, but actually when they're really poorly, their cry changes. And if you've heard lots of normal cries, you'll recognize that abnormal cry. And there's just something about it that makes you just go, hang on a second, that's not quite right. And I think we'll talk later about the paediatric GCS, and abnormal cry is in that, and how on earth do you define that? But when you've heard lots of normal crying, there's something about it that you can just tell. It's a bit like when you look at lots of ECGs, you can identify the ones that are abnormal because it's an abnormality based on lots of experience of normal. I think the other thing to think about in circulation is access for these children and how you're going to establish that. And again, that can be trickier, particularly in a volume deplete child. I think in the smaller children, don't underestimate the power of a well-placed IO. I think we used to think that was sort of a poor man's IV access, but actually you can, with a well-sited IO, you can give large volume blood resuscitation through it effectively with a good setup of a fluid warmer, a 50 ml or a 20 ml syringe, depending on the size of the child. And you can give a balanced transfusion with a plasma and a blood attached to the other side of the fluid warmer. And we found that we can actually get good volumes into these children. The other thing to think about is most pre-hospital providers don't have specific large bore access made specifically for children. And in fact, quite a lot of hospitals don't have that sort of equipment down in ED. And you can kind of make the most of what you have. And I say that again, when you're wanting to get big access in a really sick 2-year-old, it's not the time to try out central venous access in a place that you're not familiar with. So go with what you're familiar with and use things that you usually use. So in a small baby, something like a green Vigon arterial line can be useful to put in as a venous access, and just be careful with the length that you're putting in. When we get a bit bigger, we now advocate using our 4 French catheters that we use for Reboa, again, either in a femoral or a subclavian access, and just watching the line. So you can use things that you have in your kit and put them in places that you're familiar with doing. So to be able to establish appropriate large bore vascular access in these exsanguinating smaller patients. The conversation I tend to have with parents is I go and speak to them. I introduce myself and I explain what's happening. I say, I know this is the worst thing that you can ever possibly imagine. The way that we're going to get through this is just to think about it in 10-minute slots. We're not thinking about tomorrow. We're not thinking about 2 weeks down the line. We're thinking about getting through the next 10 minutes. And in the next 10 minutes, I want you to go into the house and I want you to get any medications. I want you to pack a bag with some things you'll need at the hospital. And then I want you to come back to this police officer and we will look after you. We will then give you what to do in the next 10 minutes. So it becomes a manageable amount of time and a way to actually function in this most horrific scenario that these people have found themselves in. And that 10 minutes at a time, having spoken to people afterwards, people find that quite useful because it's a manageable amount of time to not thinking about anything else. I'm thinking I can get through 10 minutes. We can all get through 10 minutes of whatever that 10 minutes is going to show. And then we can think about the next 10 minutes. And I found that quite useful, not only with parents, but also with relatives of critically injured and unwell patients.
Next up is an episode on frailty in geriatric patients with Iain Wilkinson and James Adams. So this was a hugely valuable episode, really talking about how to approach frailty in a different way and just think differently about how we communicate some of the key messages to hospital staff from the social living, but also just around using standardisation around the Rockwood Frailty Scale or indeed clinical frailty scores, just to speak that common language with the hospital as well. So here it is.
One of the things with frailty is its attention to detail, and there don't have to be lots of details, but it's just the key bits. So just a case example. So there's a gentleman I've looked after a little while ago who was in his 80s and had a combination of cognitive impairment and some learning disability, and was frail and also had significant cardiovascular disease. He was brought to hospital following a fall, and the handover said fall. Found on the floor, brought to hospital. And so we sorted him out, we got him ready to go home, and then we put him on our virtual ward and sent him home. He'd seen the physiotherapist in hospital, and they were like, no concerns raised by the paramedic crew, everything fine. It was only when he got home that we and the virtual ward team went to see him that we found that actually, so he was frail, but in addition to that, he was sort of socially frail. He had no chair in the house, no clothes in the house, bed sheets that were dirty. And we sort of like, well, how did we not know this? How did we not know this at all? And actually, we then looked at the address that he was picked up from, and he was picked up from a bus stop. And the fall was outside in the bus stop. And it's just a tiny thing. It's a tiny thing, But if it had said, fall at home, house in an awful state, we would have addressed his care completely differently when we were coming to arrange his discharge. And I think it's, that's maybe an extreme example, but I think small bits of detail, down to, found lying on the floor in the kitchen, tiled floor, lots of rugs, just that little comment, lots of rugs, suddenly raises alarm bells and people go, right, there's an intervention potentially we can do here and a potential cause that we would never know unless we were in that building and having a look. Yeah, sometimes, often I see paramedics taking photos and embedding them, and you can get a huge amount from that. We often do it mostly when people are hoarding and have Diogenes and such like, but actually in the other situations it's really, really useful for that early discharge planning, because you can just gain an idea, right, this is the house, right, okay, we've got this tiny little spindly spirally staircase, okay, that ain't gonna work. Like we can work that out from day one, that ain't gonna work, we need to rethink that. Or actually, look at this great big open plan building. It's brilliant, but they need to be able to walk 5 meters in order to hold on to anything because they're in this huge, great big space. And so you get such a wealth of information from that. And, going forwards, we're going to end up with all sorts of clever stuff, aren't we? We're going to have VR headsets that will have the house, and we could holographically project it and check that they can mobilize in their own space and all this, that, and the other. That will be amazing. But in lieu of that, just a pen portrait of the building, I think.
So finally, we look at palliative and end-of-life care. This was a hugely popular series on the podcast, and in this episode, which is the last year of life, we interview Rena Rickson and Natalie Nabunya, and we really look at how we can approach the last year of life, but also looking at certain tools like the SPICT tool to help assess as to whether a person is in the last year of life. And also we look at some of the shared decision making and how we can do that with both specialist and generalist palliative care.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a community perspective, shared decision making is vital. There's many, sort of influence the patient, or rather teams the patient will get to know while they're being cared for at home, for example, or be it in a nursing home. I think we need to remember the community services that are all available and all have an impact with this patient and all have something to contribute towards this patient's individualized care plan. And I think the importance of shared decision making is to make sure that everyone's on the same page about a patient, what their care plans are. And I think especially when we're dealing with teams that are very responsive, like London Ambulance Service, for example, I think it's very important that those decisions that have been made is known to them so that they can better support and manage these patients when they are called out to see them. And I think just also that sort of interaction with GP practices, for example, just making sure that we're all on the same page is absolutely vital to not only, support this patient group, but also to promote, I guess, our working together and sort of strengthen those relationships amongst ourselves as practitioners. So I think in terms of shared decision making, it's one of the vital aspects for all of us, for all practitioners in a patient's care.
And it is all about that rainy day thinking. It's those advanced care plans being prepared in good time with that patient at the centre of them. And it's essentially representing that patient's voice. If someone like me comes in and they can't speak to me, and I think that's the heart of it. So in London, we're very lucky. We've got the Universal Care Plan, which is an online record. It's accessible to patients through their NHS app as well. So again, that's a huge step in involving that patient in their own care. They can see it. They know exactly what is documented about them. And those bits of information are massively key to us when we're making a decision at 2:00 in the morning as to what's the appropriate treatment for this patient. When you can't call a GP, you probably can't call a hospice. You're kind of on your own. And actually that documentation is massively important. And that hopefully will contain things like a CPR decision, whether that has been made. If it hasn't been made, maybe there's a really good reason why, but I need to know that at 2:00 in the morning as a paramedic in that situation. It's really helpful. It sounds really silly, but it's really helpful to know who did you have these conversations with, whether you're perhaps a GP, if you just had conversation with patient's son, but actually they've got 4 sons and the other son's here and they haven't talked to each other. So it sounds really silly, but just tell us who you've had that conversation with. It's not just about what conversations you've had, it's who knows, because that's so vital to us when we have no one else to speak to at 2 a.m. And I think I really appreciate that these are such difficult conversations to have, and I don't have them. People like Natalie have them, GPs, specialist teams. I can't imagine how challenging they are, but the detail is so important to us.
I think we need to remember that an individual is not just a disease. We're not just looking at this is what they've got and now we need to manage them just because we know they have a disease and they need a painkiller. I think we need to make sure that we're thinking about where are they living, how are they living, who are around them, who are supporting them. There's that sort of we tend to forget how impactful their next of kin, their significant others and their family are for this patient. We need to think about sort of the psychological elements as well that could impact. Somebody could have physical pain that's just worsened by the psychological background of just being in pain, and that could just amplify a situation. So we need to recognize the other things that would be impacting on this person's life. Is there things like finances that we need to think about? It's the little things of our daily lives that we tend to forget when we come and see a palliative care patient. What's important to them? What did they enjoy? Who were they? We need to go back sort of into history and to understand the individual, and then obviously start thinking about what do you want now? How can we support you? making sure that we're taking into account how they're viewing things and how they want things to happen. And then obviously going into things like advanced care planning, starting to think about, recognizing sort of where they are and the trajectory of how things might go. And, it depends on the person. Sometimes they're not open to those conversations, and it's about building those relationships, but thinking about the future, how can we support you as things go along?
So that's it for part 1. It just leaves me to say thank you to everyone who's listened to the podcast. We'll catch you again for part 2. And it also just leaves me to say thank you to our sponsors, Pax Bags, who've been a consistent sponsor throughout this year in sponsoring the podcast. But yeah, we'll catch you for part 2 shortly. But happy Christmas, and I hope everyone has a restful break. And those on shift, I do hope for a peaceful shift over the Christmas period.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.